Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for taking time to join us today. My name is Sarah Nicolai, and I'm a transportation engineer with the consulting firm Robert Petch and Associates. And this is the second in a set of two meetings that we're holding for this study, the Ninepipe corridor feasibility study. And last night we had an open house at the Ninepipes Lodge and had a chance to talk with some of you in person. So really enjoyed that opportunity. And we also wanted to offer this virtual opportunity today as well. So the goal of today's meeting is to provide an overview of the study and share some of our findings. And after a brief presentation, we'll have an opportunity for you to share your feedback and ask any questions that you might have. So I'll start out with introductions of the rest of our study team. So representing the Montana Department of Transportation, we have Vicki Cernich, who is MDT's project manager, and she works in the Rail Transit and Planning Division. And we'll be hearing from Vicki about why MDT elected to pursue this study of the Ninepipe corridor and about what's involved in the feasibility study process. Bob Vosen, who is the administrator for the Missoula district, he is traveling today, but we're hoping he'll be able to dial into the meeting toward the end during our question and answer session. So we'll hope to see him a little bit later. With me from Robert Petch and Associates, today we have Scott Randall, who's managing the study for RPA, and Scott will present the corridor options and findings from the evaluation process. And we also have Carrie Lynch, who is one of our transportation planners and engineers, and she'll be helping us out to answer any technical questions as well. So we'll start today's meeting with a brief history of the study area, and then we'll provide some background on the purpose of the study and some of the previous outreach that we've done. Next, we'll present the options that were considered for the study, and we'll share our findings. And we'll also talk about next steps in the study process and then explain how you can stay involved. We'll save some time at the end for an open discussion period where you'll be able to type your questions and comments. And I did want to just note that we are recording this session, so we can post it online afterwards for any folks that weren't able to join us today. Before we get started with the actual presentation, I did want to touch on just a few housekeeping items. So we'll be addressing all of your questions and comments at the end of our brief presentation. In the meantime, please feel free to type your questions and comments into the Q&A box on your screen. And so we've got a little screenshot of that here on our on this slide. And you should see an icon that looks like the one in this Q&A icon here. So when you click on it, the Q&A box will pop up, and then you can type in your question or comment. After the presentation, we'll read each of the questions and comments, and our team will provide responses. So next, I will turn it over to Vicki to talk about why MDT is pursuing this study, and then provide a little background on some of the past efforts in the corridor.
Thank you, Sarah, and thanks again, everybody, for calling in and spending an hour with us. If you live or work in the area, you know that improvements to the Ninepipe segment of the US 93 corridor has been discussed for some time. So the planning efforts date back to 1996, when an environmental impact statement was completed for US 93 between Evero and Polson. So for the segment between Post Creek Hill and Ronan, which includes this Ninepipe corridor, the record of decision, or what we call the decision document, deferred the determination of specific design details. So a supplemental environmental impact statement was completed in 2008. You'll hear us talk today about the SEIS from 2008, and that's the document we're referencing. Since completion of these previous efforts, MDT has proceeded to develop projects in stretches of US 93 adjacent to the Ninepipe segment, including Ronan Urban, Ronan North, and the Post Creek Hill segments. Design for the Ronan Urban project is about 30% complete. The Ronan North project is under construction, and a virtual public meeting was held last October to give some construction update. Design is ongoing for Post Creek Hill, that segment to the south, and MDT will be continuing to provide public involvement opportunities as these projects progress. So when developing these projects that I just mentioned, MDT has encountered a number of unexpected challenges related to things like constructability, impacts, and costs. For an example, MDT ran into groundwater issues that made it difficult to design bridge structures in the Post Creek Hill area. So for the Ninepipe segment, MDT is applying some of the lessons we learned from these other projects and are proactively considering potential constraints and overall viability before a formal project is nominated for the Ninepipe corridor. So next up, I'm going to do an overview of the process that we used for the planning study. In terms of what we did for the study, we started with an analysis of relevant resources to identify any of the changed conditions since the 2008 SEIS. We conducted updated traffic and safety analysis. We reviewed land use and ownership, wetlands, floodplains and streams, wildlife and cultural resources. Comparison between this updated information gathered for the feasibility study and the conditions reported in the 2008 SEIS was pretty important to confirm previous findings and to identify changed conditions that may influence either the need or the feasibility of future corridor improvements. Next up, we conducted our feasibility evaluation. We identified 3 corridor-wide options to improve the Ninepipe segment. For these options, we looked at soils and groundwater conditions to understand constructability challenges. We also evaluated proposed structures and wildlife crossing accommodations to assess impacts and overall feasibility. We relied on input from tribal biologists, tribal cultural committees, and tribal elders, as well as state and federal agencies to help identify the most appropriate structure size and type for each crossing location, given hydraulic conditions and wildlife crossing needs. We also prepared cost estimates to understand the approximate investment needed for improvements. We completed a screening process based on 6 criteria to compare how each option performed. So right now, we are in the last step of our process, which is documenting our findings and sharing our results in meetings like these. We've developed a draft feasibility report, which is posted online for public review, and comments can be submitted to MDT through February 6th. I'm going to pass it back to Sarah now, and she'll summarize what we heard from previous outreach activities.
Thanks so much, Vicki. So in support of the feasibility study process, we've conducted a variety of outreach activities to seek input from the public and stakeholders. On the left-hand side of your screen, you'll see a series of advisory committee meetings. And throughout the entire study, we met periodically with this group, which included MDT and tribal representatives, and they helped guide our process and our methods that we used for the study. They provided comments on draft materials before we shared our work more broadly. We also had a really robust resource agency engagement process with tribal, federal, and state representatives, and those folks had expertise in wildlife, wetlands, water quality, and cultural resources. And I see a few of them with us today. We held 4 virtual meetings and an in-person field review, plus we received written comments from this group that directly influenced the options that were developed and how they were evaluated. So we really appreciated that input. We also provided 3 updates to the Tribal Council over the course of the study. And then lastly, we've provided a number of opportunities for public involvement as well. And that included multiple previous updates and public meetings. And I mentioned just yesterday afternoon, we held an in-person meeting at the Ninepipes Lodge. And then today's virtual meeting is our final public event. We'll be seeking that public input on our draft report. And as Vicki mentioned, that is posted to the study website, and we're looking for your comments before February 6th. So just wanted to highlight a few key points that we heard that influenced the direction of the study. And these reflect informal conversations as well as written comments that we received. So from the public, we heard quite a few comments about the desire to minimize impacts to adjacent properties, whether they be nearby businesses or residents that live just adjacent to the corridor. Also, kind of in line with that, number of requests for us to consider access for those residents and businesses. So as improvements are considered to the corridor, making sure that we maintain access to nearby properties. Had a couple of questions about potential funding sources and how all of these improvements will be funded. And we'll touch on that a little bit later in the presentation. We had several folks mention and want to see that we make sure and coordinate with agencies and stakeholders. So we've done that in a number of ways, as I just mentioned. And then also we heard from folks asking us to consider how improvements would connect with those other projects that Vicki had just mentioned. So the Post Creek Hill, and then also the Eagle Pass Trail project that is upcoming in the corridor. From resource agencies, we heard a number of comments about wildlife and wetland issues. So one of the top ones was to make sure that we were sizing the crossing structures according to the targeted species. So if that's elk or deer or grizzly bear, that we were making sure to consider their needs and where they are known to cross the highway in each spot. Also needed to ensure adequate vertical clearance or height and dry passage at each of these crossing locations to make sure we're encouraging use by those animals based on the likelihood and their comfort level and what they like in terms of being able to use those crossings. Had several requests to make sure that we consider the cultural and traditional elements of the landscape. A number of those comments were coming from tribal folks, as Vicki mentioned, coordination with the culture committees and the tribal elders. And then also had some comments about restoring the corridor by improving connectivity across the highway. And we'll be touching on how we addressed each of these comments as we move forward with our presentation. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Scott to present more about our options that we evaluated for the study.
Great, thank you, Sarah. So as Vicki mentioned, during the previous environmental studies that were completed, a range of corridor alternatives were considered, which included various lane configurations. For this specific segment, the Ninepipe segment, the SEIS identified a preferred alternative that consisted of maintaining the two-lane highway as it is, with providing widened shoulders and flattened side slopes to improve safety, adding new and improved wildlife crossing structures, and including a separated shared use bicycle and pedestrian path adjacent to the highway. So for the Ninepipe corridor segments, this would also connect to a divided 4-lane segment north of Burke Lane, which is what we referenced as the Ronan urban segment, and also to the Post Creek Hill segment to the south, which includes a passing lane. This preferred alternative for the Ninepipe corridor was identified with the SEIS based on its ability to meet the purpose and need of the project to improve safety and operations while minimizing costs and minimizing impacts to sensitive resources, including wetlands and wildlife. So we recognize that the preferred alternative from the SEIS, it represents a lot of previous work that was completed in collaboration with various agencies and the tribes. So this option was used as our starting points, our baseline for the study, with the focus moving forward on determining if that option is feasible to construct based on what we know today, or if any modifications are needed that may improve upon it based on our updated information and lessons learned that we'll talk about here in a minute. So with this increased knowledge, specifically with wildlife presence and movement in the corridor since the 2008 SEIS, a second option was looked at with the intent of better accommodating those wildlife needs. So just like the SEIS option, this option, we're calling it C2. This configuration includes two 12-foot travel lanes, one in each direction, with widened shoulders. The only modification to the road configuration from what was included in the SEIS is that we would steepen side slopes in the outside ditches somewhat in an attempt to minimize the impact area for construction purposes. So under this option, the shared use bike ped path would cross over to the east side of the highway, just south of the Ninepipe Reservoir. And there's some areas of widened right-of-way where the path would go around the Kettle Ponds and the Mission Mountain viewpoint, which would minimize our impacts to existing water bodies and provide better separation for pedestrians from the highway. At the same crossing locations identified in the SEIS, this option also modified the sizing of the proposed structures to include generally longer structures with that greater vertical clearance, that additional height that Sarah mentioned, which would help accommodate larger wildlife such as grizzly bears and large mammals. The biggest differences between this option and the SEIS were at the kettle ponds, where a single long structure would be provided to span the entire ponds, and similarly at Crow Creek, where a larger structure would be used based on the known movement of grizzly bears in that area. A third option was also developed in close coordination with tribal, federal, and state resource agencies, with the intent being to balance the accommodation of wildlife while minimizing impacts and costs as much as we can. So the idea for this option really started with consideration of how a wildlife overpass could be incorporated and what trade-offs we could consider at other crossing locations. So again, this configuration includes two 12-foot travel lanes, one in each direction, with widened shoulders. Like the previous option, we included somewhat steepened side slopes to minimize impacts to wetlands and adjacent properties. This option also included the same shared use path alignment that we just discussed, mostly on the east side of the highway. The primary differences with this option relate to the wildlife crossing structures. So specifically, a wildlife overpass, similar to what's included near Evero, would be provided at the Post A Canal, which is just north of Eagle Pass Trail. So this location was identified based on current wildlife use and topography in the area. The bridge at the Ninepipe Reservoir under this option would be shortened quite a bit from what was proposed in the SEIS, but additional vertical clearance would still be provided to accommodate large mammals. At the Kettle Ponds, a single bridge shorter than the previous option, the C2 option, would be provided at which would be intended to accommodate amphibians and small mammals, but not large mammals such as grizzly bears. The bridge at Crow Creek would be identical to the previous option, which again is optimized to accommodate large mammals in the area. So next I'll talk a little bit about how we evaluated these three corridor options to arrive at a preferred configuration. So first we identified a set of what we're calling screening criteria, which represent key factors with the largest influence on the feasibility and reasonableness of the proposed option. So you can see those here on your screen. So there are a set of 6 criteria that we identified. The first one, and these aren't in order of importance, but the first one we identified was related to transportation. So we considered safety, multimodal accommodations, and traffic operations for all users of the corridor under that screening criteria. For the ecological environment, we considered things like the ability to support water flow and connectivity and to minimize impacts to adjacent wetlands and water bodies and floodplains. For fish and wildlife passage, we considered how each option would accommodate safe passage for aquatic and terrestrial species, reduce wildlife mortality, provide habitat connectivity, and support protected species. For the human environment criteria, we looked at the ability of each option to minimize impacts to cultural and recreational resources, visual characteristics of the corridor, and adjacent properties. And for constructability, we considered the feasibility of construction, the impacts of construction, soil conditions. Vicki mentioned the poor soil conditions that have been encountered on past projects, and also requirements associated with each option for construction. And lastly, under cost, we looked at not just the capital cost of improvements, which of course is important, but also thinking about things like maintenance needs and additional costs there, benefit to cost ratio of how much benefit we're getting based on the amount of cost, and general cost effectiveness, and thinking about the relative fundability of each option too. We need to be realistic on what we think we could fund and what we think we could actually accomplish. So once the screening criteria were identified, we applied a numerical scoring system to rank each alternative. So the results are shown here on the screen. There's a lot of numbers to throw at you, but there is a lot more detail contained in our reports, which provides support for how we arrived at these numbers and these rankings, which we welcome you to take a closer look at if you're interested. And again, that information is on our website. So For today's meeting, I just want to cover some highlights to provide a little bit of a summary on the ranking criteria that we used and those results. So for option C1, again, that's the option that was identified from the SEIS. It primarily receives scores kind of in the middle range, between 2s and 3s for most of these criteria, that demonstrates somewhat of a balance of benefits and disadvantages. A score of 1, which indicates a fatal flaw, was awarded under the impacts category, to impacts to adjacent categories screening criteria due to the location of a building within the construction footprint. So overall, this option received the lowest combined score of the 3 alternatives. Moving to option C2, that's the larger wildlife accommodations option. This was this option was found to reduce some impacts to natural resources by incorporating steepened slopes in sensitive areas. This option also scored a bit higher than the other option, C1, for most of the criteria categories 1 through 4, but a little bit lower in the constructability and cost criteria. So this confirms that the option provides better fish and wildlife accommodations and reduces some impacts, but has negatives associated with the larger structures such as higher costs, challenges with funding, and constructability. The total score was slightly higher than option C1, as you can see there at the bottom. To develop option C3, modifications were strategically made to provide wildlife accommodations that would attract greater use, further reduce impacts, improve constructability, and reduce costs. So this option scored the same or higher than options C1 and C2 in the majority of categories, with the exception of the option resulting in some increased impacts to wetlands and reduced water connectivity compared to option C2. But overall, option C3, as you can see here, had the highest combined score when factoring in all of the categories. So while all options were deemed feasible to implement, option C3 was identified as the preferred alternative, represents the most cost-effective option with the greatest potential for funding due to it being the best balance of benefits, impacts, and costs. So quick summaries, option C3 does the best job of accommodating wildlife, minimizing the risk for wildlife vehicle collisions, and improving vehicular and pedestrian bicycle safety and operations while thinking about minimizing our costs and our impacts. So as discussed previously, the option includes widened shoulders, better fish and wildlife accommodations, shared bicycle pedestrian path, and a wildlife overpass. So based on this evaluation, option C3 was identified as the preferred option to advance for future project development considerations. So with that, I'm going to hand things back over to Sarah to discuss next steps, and then that'll lead us through an open discussion here.
Thank you, Scott. So in terms of our next steps, we mentioned that we've developed a draft feasibility study report, and that report is posted online at the study website, and we're providing a 30-day review period through February 6th. And so we encourage all of you to take a look at that report and learn more about the details of our study process and findings. Scott has just provided kind of a high-level summary, but we have quite a bit more detail in the report itself. So encourage you to take a look at that. And once the review period closes, we will consider the comments we receive, and then we'll be finalizing the study. So with that, we'd like to open it up for questions and comments. And just as a reminder, please go ahead and type your questions and comments into the Q&A box on your screen. So you should see an icon that looks like the one right here in the top corner of my screen. And if you click on it, the Q&A box will pop up, and then you can type in your questions. And as your questions and comments roll in, we'll be reading each one of those aloud, and our team will provide responses. So starting to see, starting to see several of those roll in, and I'll go ahead and read those out, and then our project team will respond. So the first one, we had a comment, no overhead wildlife passages, please. So Scott, if you would like to speak to that one.
Sure, yeah. I guess I would just say that, we evaluated the 3 options when we had a lot of discussion with resource agencies, CSKT, and other partners. The thought was with the wildlife overpass, there could be a lot of benefits for providing that wildlife connectivity and accommodations while being able to have the benefit of reducing some of our larger bridge structures and reduce some costs there. And so we found a lot of positive trade-offs between providing that overpass and improving wildlife connectivity while being more cost effective than providing much larger, more expensive bridge structures. And that was done in coordination with a lot of communication and expertise from wildlife experts and resource agencies.
Great, thank you, Scott. We've got our next question here. Mentions that Vicki said these planning efforts date back to 1996 and the SEIS is now from 2008. Can we expect to see a project develop from this study now in 2023? Scott, would you like to touch on that one as well?
Sure, and maybe I can pass it over to Vicki a little bit too. But yes, that's a very valid statement that this highway corridor, Highway 93 in general, has been evaluated for a very long time. Unfortunately, the need and the costs associated with making improvements are extremely high, as we can all understand. And so, MDT has been chipping away at pieces and doing what they can as funding allows. And we have these remaining segments between Ninepipe corridor, Post Creek, Ronan, these segments that are still left to be constructed because they're very difficult, challenging, and costly to complete. So unfortunately, we don't have enough money to go out there and complete everything that we would like to in the time that we would like to, but making use of available resources as we can. So I think the point with this feasibility study is to understand that, yes, it's been 14 years since SEIS was completed, and we need to take a look at what's changed since then to see if that still is relevant or if we need to make some modifications. We talked about a lot of that here. So the next steps would be to take this information and try to figure out how it fits within MDT's funding cycles, or if there's additional funding that may become available through grants that could be available or other means to help get this completed. So I think we would all like to see it happen as quickly as possible, and we're just trying to figure out funding sources and ways to move forward with it. I don't know, Vicki, if you had anything else you wanted to add to that topic.
No, I think, Scott, you did a really good job. I think, I just wanted to reiterate that part of the reasoning behind doing this feasibility study is because it has been 14 years, and by dusting things off and looking at the things that have changed, it sets us up to be maybe more competitive to go after grants, having a better idea of knowing how things will work in the current environment as opposed to 2008. So with this last transportation bill that we're under right now, there are plenty of grant opportunities. So it will just be hoping that we can find one that fits, and that a grant would be a good funding mechanism for moving this study into a project.
Great, thank you, Vicki and Scott. So our next question says the improved two-lane configuration proposed by the SEIS will not change with any of the three options. Is that correct? And that is correct. So the two-lane configuration is carried through all three of the options that were considered. Starting out with the SEIS, that decision was made back in 2008 to try to minimize impacts within this really sensitive portion of the US 93 corridor. As Scott had mentioned, these options do connect to passing lanes to the north and south, but the two-lane configuration is maintained through these three options. And Scott, I'll ask if you have anything else to add to that one.
Yeah, I would just note that the roadway configuration itself remained consistent based on those past decisions. There's some variation slightly between them, as we talked about with the location of the shared use path and some of our design details, such as our ditch slopes. And so we talked about a little bit about maybe looking to steepen some of those up a little bit. And what that would do is reduce our impact area, our footprint of the entire road configuration, including those ditches, to minimize some of those impacts. So slight variations, but for the paved area itself, yes, those remain consistent between the options.
Thank you, Scott. So our next question, how did the three options differ in the amount of fencing proposed? Scott, would you like to give an answer on that one as well?
Yeah, sure. I think, with any wildlife accommodations or treatments that we would make, fencing is a critical component that would need to be included and thought well thought about, in detail for how that would be accomplished. So we don't have details on exactly what fencing would look like. That would happen during project design, but all the options would require, fencing or, some treatments to make sure that we are, getting the animals to move to those crossing areas and that they're not using the highway instead. But I wouldn't say that there's a lot of difference between them, just that fencing is an important consideration with all the options that we would need to think about during design.
Thank you, Scott. So our next question, this was a comment. Thanks for offering this online meeting. When will the recording be available and where can I find it? So great question. And I'm going to jump on our slides here. So we will be posting the recording from this meeting at the study website, which is shown at the bottom of your screen. We'll get that up hopefully in the next day or two. We'll just need to get that posted online. And we will also be posting the exhibits that we shared at our in-person open house meeting from yesterday. So look for those on the website coming soon. So our next question, has there been discussion regarding the use of wildlife fencing and access structures at entrances such as county roads, field accesses, residences, and businesses? And Scott, you touched on this, but just wanted to see if you'd like to add anything else on that topic.
Yeah, I'm definitely not a wildlife fencing expert, so I probably shouldn't speak too much to that one. Although, like I said, I would just note that during the design process, those details would be figured out. And I know we got a lot of people in attendance here from resource agencies that have a lot of expertise in that, certainly more than mine. Just noting that again during that design process, those details will be figured out, and they're an extremely important consideration to ensure that any of these wildlife crossing treatments are optimized and actually work as intended.
Thanks, Scott. So next comment and question here. Wildlife overpasses are great if well designed and located. However, it seems difficult to understand how alternative 3 scores higher for wildlife and aquatic ecosystems than alternative 2, with 110 versus 800-foot bridges over the kettle ponds and less clearance, and 300 versus 600 feet bridge at Ninepipes. So I'll hand that one to you, Scott, as well.
Yeah, sure. I think it's balancing different animal uses that are in the area and different needs, and providing clear an overpass that provides clear line of sight and an open connectivity for wild animals. I think in talking with our resource agencies was a preferred solution that would work, that the thought was would work really well versus having a bridge structure that they would have to go under and would have more difficult lines of sight and open areas. And again, I'm not the wildlife expert here, so I wouldn't want to speak too much to it, except that when we talked to our resource agencies and got their feedback, we felt like that option does the best job of kind of balancing all those needs and providing different treatments for different species that are out there. Some prefer that open connectivity that an overpass would provide for, more so than they would going underneath the bridge, for example. So there's kind of a balance of all those considerations.
Thanks, Scott. Next, we have a comment. This project history actually dates back to 1988. The FEIS was the result of a long preceding process. So thanks for that comment. So next question, what support do you need to go after grants? And I'll send that one to Scott as well.
Yeah, and maybe this is a good one for Vicky to jump into as well. But for grant applications, there's a lot of different programs out there that I think we're still all trying to understand, and so each of them have different requirements. Whether that sponsor agency is the states, locals, CSKT, there's a lot of different programs out there, so it really depends on what's being sought after. I think in general, what I would say is by having this study complete and kind of this more defined solution identified, it provides more support, I guess, and hopefully puts the agency in a better position to be competitive for those grants. Any support, from other agencies, elected officials, those things go a long ways too in that grant application process. I'm not sure, Vicky, if you have any more details you could provide there as well.
No, I think the only thing that I would say was would be that so many of the grants, there's kind of speaking to the requirements, and thinking about, some of them require a project to be through the preliminary engineering phase. So it's really just, and that's not where we're at with Ninepipe. So it's really just finding one that fits our needs and will give us, I guess, the best bang for the buck to be able to move things forward.
Great, thank you, Vicki and Scott. So next question is from an attendee saying, I had to step away for a minute, so apologies if this was already addressed, but can you please clarify that going into the study, C1 was preferred, but now C3 is preferred? I believe there was a fourth option proposed by a group of biologists making some changes to the crossing structure designs. Was that considered, or will it be moving forward? Thank you. And Scott, I'll let you start us out with an answer on that as well.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. So good question. There's some of the terminology is very confusing. I totally understand that. So the C1 option was preferred from the past environmental document. So the SEIS, that was the option that was preferred and coming out of there. So that was our starting point. So that word preferred, you're right, shows up a few times and I think is very confusing, understandably so. So that option based on this study is no longer the one that we're recommending moving forward with. The C1 option that was preferred in the past, and we built off of that and looked to make improvements to that and identified C3 with the wildlife overpass as the option to recommend moving forward with. So good question on that. Regarding a fourth option, I'm not clear on the thoughts or question on that exactly. What I will say is that we originally started again with the SEIS. In working with resource agencies and other coordination, we looked at making these enlarged crossings and additional accommodations to better accommodate wildlife. And then also through those discussions identified what would happen, I guess, if we could provide a wildlife overpass. And so both of those options, C2 and C3, were based primarily on feedback from those agencies. And I think address the comments and consideration that we've been given so far. So I don't believe there's a fourth option that was discussed. I think those options blend all those comments and input that we've received to date. I don't know, Sarah, if you had any other clarification there to add.
Thanks, Scott. Yep, I can clarify. So we did receive a written letter from a group of resource agency representatives, and the attendee here is correct in that they were proposing that a new option be developed. However, what we decided to do was take all of that feedback and actually incorporate it into the C3 option. So C3 is what reflects that most recent letter that we received from those wildlife experts. So C3 is preferred, and it does incorporate all of the written comments that we received from the agencies.
Thanks for clarifying, Sarah.
Okay, so next up, an attendee asking if we can reiterate the timeline and next steps, please. So in our slides, I will just jump back a couple here. So in terms of our feasibility study, as Vicki mentioned, we are in the last step of our study process. So we're holding a public review period that extended starting January 6th and extending through February 6th. So we're asking for all of your comments on the draft report by that February 6th date. The report is posted online for your review. After February 6th, then we'll be looking at all of those comments that we receive, and we'll be addressing those. And then we'll be finalizing the feasibility study. And I would estimate we're targeting end of February for finalizing the study. Next steps after the study is completed, we've had some discussion on that, but it'll just be a matter of trying to identify those potential funding sources, looking at potential grant opportunities, and hopefully looking toward the future to make these improvements. We have another question or comments here. So numerous recent studies show that sound impacts are a more important factor for both human beings and wildlife than is commonly assumed. It would be good to see those concerns elevated in this process and brought into these planning efforts, particularly given the tendency of bridges to have bigger sound impacts and the need to consider mitigation strategies. So I'll send that one to Scott as well.
Yeah, thanks. And I believe we talked last night about the sound concerns too. And I'll say at this planning level and this feasibility study level, sound or noise analysis were not completed as part of this process, but during any design project that would be completed. So a noise study would be completed, and any mitigation needs that would be required would come out of that process. So that would be something that's more detailed that would be followed in the next steps of project development.
Thanks, Scott. So we've got another question here. Since this is part of a larger 93 corridor, was the current and projected increase in tourist traffic included, and will the proposed plan help mitigate those impacts? And Scott, will look to you to that answer as well.
Sure, yeah. I would say that yes, we did absolutely look at traffic and safety conditions as well. It was very interesting. So we looked back at the evaluation that was included in the SEIS as their starting point. So that again is pretty old, and there's been some change conditions. But the traffic data they used for the SEIS, they pointed to numbers of about 7,500 cars per day on the south side of the corridor, basically south of Montana 212. So 7,500 cars a day during that time period south of the intersection, and about 8,750 cars per day to the north of that intersection. So between 7,500 and 8,750 cars per day during an average day throughout the year. So we know there's a lot of variation with seasonal traffic and fluctuations there. So we looked at more up-to-date counts and collected some data of our own as part of this process. And what we found with 2020 data, as the data that we had available, and when we went out there and collected, traffic volumes actually ranged from about 7,000 cars a day on the south side to just over 8,500 cars a day on the north side. So actually slightly less than those documented in the SEIS were what we found for 2020. So pretty consistent traffic volumes for an average day. Now, for seasonal traffic, we found that those summer traffic volumes were about 35% higher during the summertime period than the rest of the year. So if we look at the year as an average versus the summer traffic was about 35% higher. So yes, we did consider traffic. We also looked at some different growth scenarios of how the corridor might grow, and traffic volumes are high. You know, we understand that. I think talking about balancing the number of lanes to accommodate that traffic and the impacts associated with that was a big challenge. That was a big challenge from 2008. And as Sarah mentioned, those trade-offs were discussed, and the decision was made to stick with one lane in each direction on this portion of Highway 93. So recognizing also that the other segments would provide additional lanes that are less environmentally sensitive or have less issues with impacts associated with adding those lanes. So trying to treat the corridor as more holistically to accommodate traffic growth and not just focusing on the small segments and what that might look like. So challenging question and not a perfect solution. And I think it goes to us, you know, again, trying to consider those trade-offs and balancing different needs and impacts associated with making improvements too.
Thank you, Scott. So our next question, will the access control plan for Highway 93 on the reservation continue to be enforced regarding access consolidation or rerouting to county roads where possible? And what about regarding requests for new access points? And I'll hand that one to Scott as well.
Yeah, that's probably another question I'd punt on a little bit. It's outside of what we look at with this study. The MDT district office would be a good place to submit that comment, and I think we could follow up with you after this. But there's an access control plan in place. I would say that yes, that would be followed. That's the intent of having those in place, but I don't know the specifics as it relates to this corridor to speak to.
Thank you, Scott. So the next two questions are related, so we'll combine them. The first one asks, what design and engineering will be needed following this study? And then the second one asks, given the work anticipated, do you have an estimate on when the preferred alternative will go to design, and what might be the estimated date of construction commencement? So we'll hand that to Scott, and Vicki might be able to chime in as well.
Yeah, thanks. And that's another one that's a challenge because we just don't know. enough about where that funding would come from to date. Basically, you know, if grants were pursued and grants become available and are secured for this portion or any portions of Highway 93, that project development process looks a lot different than if it just goes into MDT's traditional project delivery process. If you secure a grant, they have requirements for when that money needs to be obligated and spent, and so that can move the process along a lot quicker. But outside of that, this project would fall outside of MDT's current funding window, which they plan for 5 years out. So at a minimum, it would be outside of that window. But I can tell you there's a lot of need within the area, within the districts, that's far greater than the money that's available. And that's why we're talking about things like grants and other opportunities to try to get something improved. Otherwise, it does look like it's quite a ways out. I don't know, Vic, if you had anything else you wanted to add to that point, but
No, other than, MDT and all of the districts do have to prioritize and plan out their funds for the next 5 years based on needs. And there's currently no available funding through 2027 for this project as it stands. That doesn't mean that there won't be opportunities to look at grants that fit. And like Scott said, that would definitely increase sorry, that would definitely cause the project to move forward a little quicker, given the requirements of when grant funding needs to be obligated and spent.
Great, thanks, Vicki and Scott. So it looks like we have answered all of the questions. Oh, here's one more. Is there funding available to develop the engineering plans after this process? And clarification within MDT. We've touched on this a little bit, but I'll let Scott and Vicki speak to this question as well.
yeah, I would just say the funding that's been obligated to date for this corridor is related to this feasibility study. So after this feasibility study is complete, there has not been any other additional funding obligated to take the next step. So that would have to be discussed. The intent was to figure out first what this option looks like and you know, determine, I guess, the next steps from there. So now that we know what that configuration looks like, what the costs might be to implement that, then the department can figure out what the next steps look like to move forward. Again, whether that's through grants, through normal project delivery, that has not been determined yet.
Thanks, Scott. And kind of following up on this topic, our next question is asking if we can just revisit design and engineering next steps, regardless of the timeline, just in terms of what would need to happen. And then a follow-up with that as well. Will the recently enacted Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, IIJA, increase funding opportunities and shorten project timelines? So Scott, if you'd like to follow up on those two questions.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that, you know, this project could take a couple different paths depending on, again, that funding. That's the critical element here, but it could go through a normal process of moving into project development, which would be, you know, going into design and the engineering next steps as you referenced, through a standard process. Or if through that new funding bill, if a grant were to be secured, that could look a lot of different ways through whether that's standard development or design build or different processes depending on those grant opportunities. So I would say just a lot of TBD, to be determined on those next steps. Nothing has been identified past this point. Once that decision is made, then it's up to MDT to figure out again how that fits within their program for the rest of the district.
Thanks, Scott. And I guess I can speak just quickly to this question about the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and that increase in funding. Bob Vosen, I mentioned he's the Missoula District Administrator, and at our open house meeting, he was speaking on this topic, mentioning that although it's quite a bit of money coming from the federal government through that act, It actually covers MDT's 5-year program, plus about an additional 25% is what he was mentioning. So it seems like it should be a lot more, but it's actually just an increase of about 25% over what MDT had been planning for. And as we all know, with inflation and price increases, that additional 25% is actually just being eaten up in project budgets because of increased costs. So what that funding bill does is really kind of guarantee and allow MDT to continue their programs for the next 5 years. It doesn't necessarily open up a whole brand new pot of money that's awarded automatically to MDT. But as Scott has mentioned, it does open up new opportunities for grant funding, and Vicki has spoken to this as well. So hopefully this corridor is set up well to pursue some of those new grant funding opportunities.
The challenge being with those grants is that they are competitive nationwide. So we're competing against other needs that are out there too. But the more support and information we have to go into those grant processes, it just increases your opportunity and potential likelihood of success there too.
Thanks, Scott. So next question, if funding does not happen until more than 5 years down the road, will you have an opportunity to reevaluate the feasibility study if new information is available? And Scott, would you like to speak to that one?
I can talk to a little bit high level there, I guess, again, depending on what that project development process looks like, there would have to be a revised environmental document that would be completed. I believe that would be, within those project development next steps. And so that SEIS, again, it's 14 years old. We have updated information and an updated recommendation to move forward with. And so all that would be incorporated into that environmental process, whatever that looks like for that project development.
Thanks, Scott. And Vicki, did you have anything else to add on that topic as well?
No, I was just going to mention that either, we would look at things either through the feasibility study, but, ultimately an environmental document would need to be done for this section as well. And so that would be a great opportunity to look at whatever's changed.
Great. Thanks, Vicki and Scott. And our next question is MDT looking into the wildlife crossing pilot program? So this is one of those opportunities that we've been speaking to. And Scott or Vicki, if you'd like to respond on that one.
I'm going to I'll start. So I need to refamiliarize myself with the wildlife crossing pilot program. We saw that it was going to be a grant opportunity when the transportation bill came out, but it was one of the grants that wasn't funded. So just recently, with the 2023 appropriation, it is funded. So we'll have to go back and revisit that. And, that is certainly one of those grant programs that would help move this along.
Thanks, Vicki. So we have another question. Because of the number of traffic deaths that have occurred along this section of highway, I believe it should receive high priority. And that's a great comment. I think certainly recognizing the impact to human safety is very important. And I know that's why MDT is focusing on this corridor, but would love to hear if Scott or Vicki have any other thoughts on that.
Yeah, I would just note that oh, sorry, Vicki, do you want to start?
No, I was just gonna add that I was remiss in providing any little description about the Eagle Pass Trail safety improvement project that will be happening in the near future, and that will be turn lanes from 93 going on to Eagle Pass Trail, and that wasn't part of the background information that I provided. So that certainly, isn't the end all be all, but it will definitely help with some of the accidents that occur in that area. Scott?
Yeah, thanks, Vicki. That's Good reminder. So there is a separate safety improvement project to add turn lanes to the intersection with Eagle Pass Trail, and that's one of the areas that was identified as a safety concern. And so that's being administered and programmed through a different funding source through the highway safety improvements projects. So there's funding that's intended for safety improvements, and that's how that intersection improvement project is moving forward. So that's separate of this, but will help improve safety. And so I think, in general, we are looking for ways to improve safety. Sometimes it requires very large investments for major improvements. Sometimes it's smaller things like adding rumble strips and that sort of thing too. What I will note is that the SEIS, the evaluation that was completed there, um, the crash analysis and safety analysis that was completed there identified a crash severity of about 5% fatal crashes and a very high severity rates. Since that point and through updated information, that safety has improved considerably, at least from a severe crashes standpoint. So we've had a lot less, lower percentage of severe crashes. We've had a little bit higher crash rate, number of crashes, but those crashes have been a lot less severe, which is a positive. But with traffic conditions and everything else, luckily those crashes have been less severe since the SEIS, which is a positive. But still looking at incremental improvements to improve safety through the corridors we can.
Great, thank you both. And as a follow-up to the conversation about the Eagle Pass Trail project, next question is, will that safety project include access to the Ninepipes Lodge? And Scott, I'll let you take that one.
Yeah, I'll say that the project's just getting underway, but definitely understand the location and proximity of the access to the lodge there is, it's very close to the intersection and will need to be looked at. I don't have any information as far as recommendations or exactly what that's going to look like, just that it will definitely be included as for consideration of how to make improvements there, and more will be coming soon on that project.
Great, thanks, Scott. So we've got another question. Will the C3 proposed wildlife crossing be similar in scale and size to that which is constructed and located north of Evero? And we'll have Scott speak to that one as well.
Yeah, I think potentially that was our baseline for evaluation, was looking at that Evero overpass as a starting point. I think there's, as with everything, there's always lessons learned and ways to improve upon that. Also, there's specific site conditions that will influence what that will look like. But I'd say in general, that's kind of the concept, we think about when looking at an overpass structure for wildlife. But the discussion would be had with resource agencies and other experts to figure out how we could make it best accommodate the wildlife in the area, in particular grizzly bears, and what they would like to see. So I think that's a good starting point, but obviously the design details, would be hashed out during that process.
Thanks, Scott. And just to add to that, I'll note that we did receive some feedback from resource agencies that, of course, there's been additional research about wildlife species and their use of those overpass crossings. And it turns out that they like a kind of a flatter top. And so there might be some consideration to flatten the top portion of that overpass to hopefully be more inviting to some of the larger species targeted. So as Scott mentioned, during a future design process, MDT would look at the very latest research and data in terms of wildlife use and attractiveness to design those overpasses. So our next question, this is relating to implementation of our preferred option in the future, saying that there won't be detours during construction, but will there be anything done to address people voluntarily detouring onto unpaved county roads? And I'll let Scott speak to that one as well.
Yeah, I don't have again, concrete answer on that. I mean, we haven't completed traffic control plans or understand construction phasing and sequencing at this point. What I'd say is we can't restrict people from driving, on public roads. They're public roads and they're open. But I would say that the intent would be to maintain traffic on the highway corridor, and whether that's building adjacent temporary structures, during construction to facilitate that. We would not be looking at rerouting traffic onto county roads, as the primary source of traffic control. But if somebody chooses to do that, I mean, people can drive, like I said, how they want on public roads, but that would not be the intent. The intent would be to keep the highway functional and to accommodate traffic control on the highway, whether that's again through adjacent building and adjacent alignments and temporary structures to make that happen. But we would not be looking to use county roads to accommodate traffic control.
Great, thank you, Scott. So that brings us through our open questions, and I'll just bring everyone's attention back to our screen here. If you weren't able to type in your question, or if you have any additional questions, please do feel free to reach out to our study contacts. Vicki with MDT or Scott with RPA would be very happy to respond. And you can send your questions and comments by email, or you're also welcome to call them by phone. And I'll just, again, lastly, encourage everyone to take a look at our study website. We have posted that draft report. And if you're interested in reading more detail about our findings, we are asking for comments by February 6th on that report. We do have one final question. I know we're at the top of the hour, but we can hopefully just answer this one more question. Also wondering about the bike ped crossing from east to west. Will it be at grade or in a culvert? And I'll let Scott speak to that one.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, definitely. We would not be looking at making a crossing at grade. So we would be looking at likely an underpass so the pedestrians would pass underneath the highway. More details would have to be figured out, obviously for what that looks like. But with the preferred configuration, the idea would be we would be raising the highway grade up as we get towards the Ninepipe reservoir to accommodate that vertical clearance and that bridge structure for the highway, and then being able to pass the pedestrians underneath the highway before the reservoir.
Great, thank you, Scott. So that brings us to the end of our open questions and the end of our allotted time here. So just really appreciate everyone's participation today and interest in our study. Encourage you all to take a look at our website, and please do send in any comments by February 6th. Thanks, everyone.